The dowager set down her fork on the porcelain with the soft click of a woman who has decided to be caught. And into the small quiet that followed, she said, "Is this what you call a bride, Carrington?" Honoria felt the heat climb her throat and stop at her jaw. She kept her hands in her lap. She kept her shoulders square. The breakfast room at Carrington House had been laid for 40, and 40 pairs of eyes had travelled from the dowager's plate to her own face. A footman by the sideboard froze, with a tureen of consommé halfway lifted. The June light fell across the table in long, bright bars and lit her sage-green sleeve where the cuff had been turned last winter to hide a thinning at the elbow. And Honoria thought, very plainly, she has seen the cuff. They have all seen the cuff. There is nothing to do but breathe. To her right, her husband of 2 hours set down his cup. He did not set it down hastily. He set it down the way a man sets down a glass he has been holding too long. Deliberate, the small, careful angle of a finger that has decided exactly where the rim will sit. The cup made no sound. Honoria saw his jaw move once, and she saw the corner of his mouth, the left corner, the one she had noticed in the vestry that morning when he had taken her hand and turned the ring twice on her finger before he could fit it, pull a fraction upward. Not a grin, the precursor to one. The ghost of an expression a man wears when something he has predicted to the half hour has happened on schedule. Adrian Hartley, 5th Duke of Carrington, smiled at his great-aunt across his wedding breakfast and said, "I do call her my bride, man. I have just signed the register to that effect. There is a clerk at St. George's who would attest to it under oath." He inclined his head. "Aunt Maud." The dowager's hand closed around the stem of her glass. "I had thought," she said, "that we agreed. We agreed on a great many things." The Duke's voice was low and even, and carried without any apparent effort to the far end of the table, where Lady Caroline Pelham had laid her napkin across her lap, with the careful symmetry of a woman who has been schooled in carriage from the age of 4. "We agreed that Carrington wanted a settled household. We agreed that a duke ought not to be a bachelor at 28. We agreed that I should marry before the summer adjournment of the Lords. I have done all 3. The lady in the green is my wife. You may," he added, lifting his cup again, "call her Duchess. The clerk would attest to that also." A small ripple moved through the room. It was not laughter. It was the thinner, nervous breath that follows a person realizing the rules of the next hour have been set, and they did not write them. Honoria kept her eyes on the salt cellar. She counted. She had counted in worse rooms. "Carrington," the dowager said again, and now her voice had a gentler edge, the edge of a woman who has begun to realize she has misread the play. "I meant no slight to the lady. I meant only that, given the connections one might have expected, given the houses one might have allied with—" "Given Caroline Pelham," the Duke said pleasantly, and Lady Caroline did not move a muscle of her face. "Yes, Aunt, I take your meaning. I have considered Caroline. Caroline is a very accomplished woman. I have chosen, however, to marry Miss Wexford. The reasons are mine. They are, I assure you, sufficient. Shall we have the strawberries?" "Carrington, the strawberries, James." The footman moved. Honoria, who had been holding her breath without knowing it, let it out very carefully into the quiet, and watched her husband eat a strawberry with the kind of slow, dry pleasure that a man uses when he has won an argument no one else has yet noticed was an argument. He did not look at her. He did not need to. She felt his attention on her left hand where the new ring sat heavy and unfamiliar, and she felt the precise moment he registered that her hand had not trembled. And she felt, though she could not have explained it to her aunt or her uncle or the quiet God of her childhood church, that he was pleased. She did not understand him yet, but she had walked back down the aisle on his shoulder an hour ago, and she had caught in the porch of St. George's a woman she did not know say to another, "Well, that is what comes of letting a man choose for himself." And she had thought, with a small, dry shock of recognition, he caught that. He did not flinch. He did not look at me to see whether I had caught. That means he expected it. That means he planned for it. That means I am not what these people think I am. She knew only that the man on her left had crossed London to fetch her out of a Suffolk parsonage, and had spent 4 hours in her uncle's bookroom asking her, very precisely, about substitution ciphers in French commercial correspondence. That he had proposed marriage at the end of the 4th hour, in 2 sentences, without rising from his chair, and that her uncle, who had spent 40 years in the Admiralty's still rooms before he took orders, had nodded once and said, "He means it, child. Decide." She had decided. She had been deciding, in some still part of her, from the moment she had understood that the Duke was not asking her uncle for an introduction. He was asking her. She lifted her water glass. The Dowager was, by then, addressing some neutral remark to the bishop on her left. Lady Caroline was, by then, eating a strawberry with the air of a woman who has not noticed anything at all. The Duke, beside her, lowered his head a fraction and said, under cover of the renewed murmur of the table, "Forgive my aunt. She had her own candidate." "You are not distressed?" "I should not be useful to you, distressed." She felt, more than saw, the angle of his head shift a 1/4 inch toward her. "Honoria, if you will. We are past Miss Wexford." "Honoria, then." He picked up his fork. "I will say this once. I did not marry you because I could not find better. I married you because I could not find another. Do you understand the distinction?" "I think so." "Then we may have the strawberries in peace." She had the strawberries. They were the best she had ever eaten, and she would remember it afterwards with a wry, small twist of the mouth, that on the morning of her humiliation at the hands of the First Society of England, she had also eaten the best strawberries of her life. The carriages came at noon. The wedding party dispersed. The Dowager kissed her on both cheeks, with the small, impersonal touch of a woman discharging a duty, and Lady Caroline did not kiss her at all, but extended a gloved hand and said, "I shall call on you, Duchess. Wednesday, perhaps." And Honoria said, "I shall be at home, my lady." And the 2 women looked at one another for the space of a held breath. There was no warmth in the look. There was, on Lady Caroline's side, a small bright flicker of something that was not quite hatred and not quite curiosity, but a near cousin of both. Honoria filed it. She had begun, that morning, to file a great many things. The Duke handed her into the travelling coach at 1 o'clock. The horses moved. She watched London slide past the window, and she thought, not for the first time, and not for the last, "I am a duchess by 9:30 of a Tuesday morning in June, and I do not yet know what for." Beside her on the leather seat, her husband closed his eyes and slept for the entire 11 miles to Carrington Park. The way a man sleeps who has not slept in 3 nights. She watched him sleep. She watched the small twitch at the corner of his jaw when the coach jolted over a rut, and the dark hair fall a little forward across his brow. And she thought, with a careful, clinical attention that had nothing to do with sentiment, that he had the face of a man carrying a thing he could not put down. She had seen that face on her uncle, the year the prize court decided the Resolute case against his evidence. It was the face of a person who had decided something they could not undo. The coach turned through the lodge gates at Carrington Park at 3:20 in the afternoon, and the Duke woke without starting, and without seeming surprised to find her watching him, and he said, very stilly, "Welcome to your house, madam." And she said, "Thank you, your grace." And she meant it. And they did not speak again until they were on the steps. The first night at Carrington Park, Honoria lay in a bed she did not know, in a room she had not chosen, with the curtains drawn against a moon she could not see, and she caught, through the wall, her husband walk for an hour without stopping. She knew it was him. The bootfalls were too heavy for a maid, and too steady for a chamberlain, and they had the particular rhythm of a man working out a problem with his feet, because his head had refused to settle it. The pacing went from the window to the door and back, then a pause. 6, 7 seconds. And then a single different step, sharper, as though he had crossed to a desk and set something down. Then the pacing again. She did not get up. She did not knock. She lay on her back in the unfamiliar bed and she listened to her husband walk. And she thought about the way he had said, at his own wedding breakfast, "I could not find another." And she thought about the dowager's voice. "Is this what you call a bride?" And she felt, very slowly, the shape of a thing she had not yet given a name to begin to harden behind her ribs. She was here for something. Not for her face, not for her dowry, which was nominal, not for the connection, which was small. He had married her for a reason. He had told her so. He had refused to tell her what the reason was. She would discover it. She had spent 12 years in a bookroom learning to discover things, and she had not married a duke this morning in order to become decorative. She made, in the dark, the second decision of her wedding day. The first decision had been to say yes in her uncle's bookroom. The second decision was simpler and harder. She would earn whatever it was he had married her for. And then, when she had earned it, she would ask him, across his own desk, in his own library, with the lamp burning between them, what it was. And he would tell her. Or she would leave by the morning coach. The bootfalls in the next room stopped. There was a long quiet. Then, very softly, she caught her husband say a single word into his own dark room, a word she could not quite catch, but which she thought, with the small, precise instinct that had served her well in her uncle's bookroom, might have been her name. She closed her eyes. She slept. She woke at 5:30. She dressed herself without ringing for the maid because she had been dressing herself since she was 7 and had no intention of beginning the habit of strangers in her shift today. She put on the sage green again. She had 2 day gowns and one was being aired, and she pinned up her hair without a glass. She would, before she left this house, learn the name of every door and every wing and every back stair, because the only way to be useful in a house was to know it. The corridor outside her bedchamber ran east and west. She went straight ahead, through a small door inset in the linen fold paneling, and down 2 flights and along a flagged passage that smelled of soap and bacon fat, and she came out by a small unmarked door in the bookroom. It was the wrong room. She knew at once. A bookroom is a working room with a clerk's high desk and ledgers stacked on a side table, and the dry, woody smell of a place where things are written down. This was the library. Long, high, south-facing, 2 stories of shelves with a gallery running round the upper level and the great bay window facing the parterre. The carpet was Aubusson, and worn at the centre by generations of feet. A lectern held an open atlas to the Mediterranean coast, from Toulon to Genoa. A green-shaded lamp burned low on a writing desk set in the bay, and behind the desk, her husband sat in shirt-sleeves, his cravat untied across his shoulders, a pen in his hand, and a paper before him, and 3 open books, and a slim, quarto-bound volume she recognized, at 20 feet, as a French commercial directory of the year 1819. He looked up. He did not start. He had caught her. She had not been still, and the door had a small, unoiled hinge that had sighed as it opened. But he had elected, as he had elected at the breakfast yesterday, not to give the sound the dignity of a turn of the head until he was ready for it. "Madam," he said. She inclined her head. "You are up early." "I am up at the usual hour. I had not realized this room would be in use." The fire in the small study had been lit not an hour, and the smell of the new coals sat low in the room. "I had not realized," he said dryly, "that this room would be visited. I have, until this morning, been in the habit of supposing it private at this hour. I shall withdraw." "You will not." He set the pen down. He pressed his chair back a fraction, not standing. Adrian Hartley was not, she had begun to understand, a man who rose for politeness. He rose for women he liked, and he had not yet liked her enough to do it, and the absence of the gesture was, in its way, the most honest thing about him. and he laid his open hand across the paper before him, as though to cover it from her sight. The gesture was small and unconsidered, and he was, she thought, unaware that he had made it. "You are in your own house. I am the visitor here. Sit down." She did not sit down. She had been brought up to take dictation, and she would not take a seat in front of a man who was, even in courtesy, half hiding a paper from her. She crossed instead to the bay window and stood looking out at the parterre. The dew was still on the box. A gardener with a barrow was moving along the south wall, and beyond him the park opened in long shaved lawns toward a stand of elms and a glimpse, between the elms, of a lake the color of an oyster shell. It was a view a duchess would be expected to admire. She admired it for the conventional number of seconds, and then she turned and said, "Are you decoding correspondence, Your Grace?" There was a quiet. It was, she thought, a useful quiet. She had counted, last night in the dark, on his being a man who could be made to answer a direct question by the courtesy of his own instinct. She had been right. He looked at her a moment, and then he said, "Yes." "French commercial?" She said yes. "Substitution or transposition?" "Substitution. The directory beside me is the key. The 1819 Almanach du Commerce. May I see?" He did not move his hand from the paper. He looked at her with an expression she could not quite read. The corner of the mouth again twitched, but the eyes were quite still and quite dark and very intent. "Miss Wexford," he spoke her name. "Honoria. I do not yet know what I have married." "You know precisely what you have married." She felt, for the first time since the dowager had set down the fork, the slow burn of her own temper rise to the back of her throat. And she let it rise. She had decided last night to let it rise, when the occasion required. And the occasion required it now. "You spent 4 hours in my uncle's bookroom, and you spent 3 of them establishing exactly what I could and could not do. I do not believe you spent £1,000 and a special license and a half day of your great aunt's mortification to acquire a woman whose accomplishments were a mystery to you. I am not a mystery. I am a tool. I should prefer to be used." The silence after she said it was the longest yet. She held his gaze. She did not blink. She felt the warm flush rise up her throat to her jaw, and she did not move to cold it. She had said the word tool deliberately. She had wanted to see what he would do with it. He sat back. He lifted his hand from the paper. He turned the paper, very slowly, around on the desk, so that the writing faced her. And he said, "Read it." She crossed the carpet to the desk. The paper was a fair copy in his own hand, a clerk's hand, really, trained to write so that another man could read his minutes without squinting, of a French commercial letter dated the 3rd of March. The body discussed, in plain language, the consignment of casks of palm oil from a Liverpool rough to a buyer at Cadiz. Below it, in his hand again, ran a column of penciled numbers. She read the body, she read the numbers. She put a finger on the 3rd numbered group and said, "These do not refer to the palm oil." She said no. "They refer to a second consignment. They are using the oil casks as a cover." She said yes. "And the second consignment is—" She lifted her eyes from the paper to his face. "Human." His face did not change. He said, very stilly, "Yes." She set down the paper. She walked very deliberately to the bay window and stood with her back to him, and she made herself breathe 4 times before she turned back. He had not moved. He was watching her with the same quiet, dark attention. "How many letters?" she said. "At present, 43. There will be more. They come in through a friendly hand at the Liverpool Exchange, and a second friendly hand at the Cadiz Consulate. The originals are at a house in town. I have working copies here." She turned the page of the directory in her lap and waited. "Why have you not turned them over to the Admiralty?" "Because the Admiralty has, in the present configuration of the prize courts, a certain weak hinge. The Aberdeen Committee sits in November. The bill that comes out of it will either close the hinge or leave it open for another decade. I require an independent translation of every letter, with the cipher reduced and the consignment numbers reconciled to the bills of lading, in a hand that cannot be subpoenaed. A clerk's hand can. My own can. A wife's hand cannot. Spousal privilege. She said yes. You married me for the privilege. I married you, he said evenly, because the privilege is useless without a woman who can do the work. Your uncle says you have read French commercial correspondence since you were 15, and cracked a 4-letter substitution at 16 on a wager. He says you would not stop until the work was right, even when he told you the work was no longer necessary. He set the pen down. I have not been able, in 3 months of looking, to find another woman in England who fits the brief. I have asked the Admiralty quietly, and at Cambridge, and at 2 convents in the West Country, and in the end I asked your uncle. He sent me to you. You answered every question I put to you in 4 hours, without once attempting to flatter me. She kept her eyes on his hand on the desk. I do not propose to lie to you about the brief. I propose to tell you the brief, every morning, in this room, at 6:30. The rest of your day is your own. You may, by and by, find that the brief is not the whole of the marriage. That is not a promise. It is, at the moment, the most honest sentence I have to give you. She did not answer at once. She crossed back to the desk. She picked up the paper. She looked at it again and she said, I should like the directory. He passed it. She set it on the desk, and she sat down in the chair opposite his. Not asked, no permission given. The Duchess sitting in her own library at 6 in the morning of the first day of her marriage. She opened the directory to the index. She ran a fingertip down the column for Liverpool houses. She said, very quietly, I shall need the bills of lading for each of the 43 letters, and the ship's manifests where you have them, and a quiet maid to bring tea. He smiled. He smiled fully this time, the corner of the mouth she had noticed in the vestry, but the other corner too, pulled into a frank, quiet expression that took 10 winters off his face and made her breath catch in her throat for one improper half-second before she returned her eyes to the directory. And he said, Mrs. Galpin shall bring the tea. She is the only one in the house I trust with the working copies. Then we have a household. Then we have a household, Duchess. She did not let him see what her face did at the word Duchess in that register. Quiet, deliberate, the precise pronunciation of a man who had decided, in the small hours, that the title would mean something between them. She turned to the page of the directory. She said, 43 letters, Your Grace. I shall want a week. You shall have a week. He folded the paper and set it aside. The clock on the mantel struck the half-hour, and the original of the 3rd March letter. I cannot work from a copy alone for the longer cipher passages. You shall have the original tomorrow. He stood, this time, for her this time, and she filed it, and gathered his coat from the back of the chair. I shall leave you the desk. I keep a smaller study off the estate room. I shall be at breakfast at 9. Will you come down to it? I will come down to it. My great-aunt will be at breakfast. She knew. She will, I am afraid, have a great deal to say. She is welcome to say it. I shall be eating eggs. The corner of his mouth pulled again. He inclined his head, a quarter bow, no more. The Duke's small private acknowledgement that he had been outmanoeuvred, and rather liked it. And he left her in the library, with the directory open at the Liverpool index, and the green-shaded lamp burning low against the brightening day. The first letter took her 2 hours. The second took 90 minutes. By the time the bell rang at 5 minutes to 9, she had reduced the 3rd March letter to a clean transcript with the cipher passages annotated in the margin. She had begun, too, to see the shape of the Liverpool rough. 3 houses, not 1, the respectable being the public face and the unrespectable the cover, all 3 reporting by an invisible thread to a single partner, whose surname she had caught, for the first time, at her own wedding breakfast. Honoria laid her pen down. She looked at the surname in the directory. She looked at the surname in the cipher transcript. She let the silence of the library settle around her like dust falling. Pelham. She closed the directory. She rose. She smoothed the sage green over her hips. She walked to the breakfast room with her chin up and her hands quiet at her sides. And when the dowager said, before she had even reached her chair, "Honoria, I must speak to you about the south drawing room. It will not do as you have it. Lady Caroline will laugh at us." Honoria sat, took her napkin into her lap and said, very pleasantly, "I shall be very glad of your advice, Mum. Lady Caroline is calling on Wednesday." She did not look at her husband. She caught, very faintly, the porcelain click of his cup being set down on his saucer. She thought, with a small, dry inner amusement, that she had just amused her husband for the second time in 12 hours, and that she was beginning, against every plan she had made the night before, to enjoy it. The dowager devoted Tuesday to the south drawing room. She moved through the rooms of Carrington Park with the careful proprietorial step of a person who had been mistress here in her own lifetime, and had not yet conceded that she was not the mistress now. She wore black bombazine. She had worn it since the Duke's brother had been laid in the family vault the previous May, and she carried a small silver vinaigrette which she lifted, at intervals, to her nose. "This wallpaper," she said, "is 40 years old. Caroline will see it. Caroline will think we cannot afford to repaper." "Caroline will be incorrect." The dowager paused. She turned. She fixed Honoria with the small bright eye of a woman who has not, in a great while, been answered back by a niece in sage green muslin with a turned cuff. "I beg your pardon?" "I said, ma'am, that Lady Caroline will be incorrect. We can afford to repaper. Carrington is one of the 4 richest estates in the home counties. The state of the wallpaper is the result of preference, not of poverty. If Lady Caroline draws another conclusion, the error will be hers." The dowager set the cup down with the small, precise click she used for assent. "You are blunter than I had expected." "I am only as blunt as I was raised to be, ma'am. My uncle is the rector of St. Margaret's at Wexford in the Marsh. He has said exactly what he meant in the pulpit for 30 years. He saw no reason to require less of his niece in the parsonage parlour." "And your aunt?" "My aunt was lost when I was 11. "Ah." The dowager's hand closed for one small, involuntary moment on the vinaigrette. She set it down on a coaster of mother of pearl, and she looked at Honoria with a slightly altered expression. Not warmer, precisely, but cleared, as one clears a window of a fine summer dust. "Forgive me. I had not been told." "There was no reason for you to be told, ma'am. It was a long while ago." The dowager nodded once. She picked up the vinaigrette again. She moved to the south window, and she stood a moment with her back to Honoria, and she said, in a voice that did not carry beyond the panes, "Caroline Pelham was raised in this house, you understand." "I had been told something of it, ma'am." "Her mother and the late Duchess were schoolfellows. Caroline spent every summer of her childhood at Carrington. There had been, an understanding." Honoria kept her hands quiet in her lap. The fire irons made their small, dry tick in the grate. "Between Caroline and his grace. Between the families. Carrington never spoke. He was abroad till he was 24. When he came home, his brother was already ill, and the next 2 winters were not a season in which one speaks of understandings." The dowager's hand turned the vinaigrette a 1/4 inch on a table. "Then Henry was gone. Caroline came up from Pelham at Easter to sit with us. She was very good in the house. She knew where the linen was kept. She knew when the bishop ought to be invited and when he ought not to be. I have begun, by Whitsun, to permit myself the small, foolish hope of a thing that had not been settled, and was not, perhaps, mine to settle." She paused. "And then, in March of this year, Carrington left for Suffolk for 4 days, without explaining himself to me. And he came back, betrothed, and the lady he was betrothed to was not Caroline. I am very sorry, Mom." You are sorry for your disappointment. The disappointment is real. It is not unjust. The dowager turned. She looked at Honoria for a long moment, and her face did the small, careful work of a woman recalibrating something she had not expected to need to recalibrate. You are an odd creature. So I have been told, Ma'am. You are very young. The dowager's eyes did not leave her face. I am 26, Ma'am. That is very young when one is 74. The dowager came back from the window. She seated herself in the high-backed chair by the chimney-piece and said, What did Carrington tell you, child, about why he was marrying you? Honoria thought, very fast. He told me, she said, that there is work I can do which he requires done by a hand that cannot be subpoenaed. He told me he had searched 3 months for that hand and had found no other. He told me that the marriage was, at least for the present, primarily on that ground. He told me he did not propose to lie to me about the brief. The dowager went very still. I see, she said. You did not know, Ma'am. The dowager moved the vinaigrette an inch to her left and then an inch back. I knew there was a brief. I did not know its shape. She lifted the vinaigrette and set it down again. Carrington is not a man who acquires things idly. I had supposed the brief would be of a kind a man does not speak of to his great aunt. I had not supposed it would be of a kind he speaks of to his wife in the first week of the marriage. He is honest, Ma'am. He is more honest, perhaps, than I had given him credit for. She looked at Honoria. The look had altered again. Caroline will test you on Wednesday. She will smile, and she will make small, sharp remarks about your dress and your county and your accomplishments. She is in great pain, child. The pain does not excuse her, but it explains her. I shall sit beside you, and I shall not, today, prevent her. Pressure is a thing one learns to bear by bearing it. If you ask me, I shall tell you which of her remarks to answer and which to let fall. I think you will not ask me. I shall be at your right hand all the same. Thank you, ma'am. You are not to call me ma'am at every sentence. Aunt Maud will do. The rest of the family have done with it for 40 years. He acknowledged the name. That is better. They worked through the south drawing room together until the lamps were lit. Honoria, on her own initiative, had a footman take down the heavy crimson curtains and hang in their place the lighter sprigged ones from the chintz parlour. They had been the late duchesses and had not been hung in 12 years, and the room, in their new light, lifted 6 inches off its own gravity. The dowager, at the door, paused and looked back and said, "Yes, that will do." She did not say to Caroline. The name was understood between them. Caroline came at 3 o'clock on Wednesday. She came in a peach silk that had cost, Honoria estimated, twice the value of every garment in her own wardrobe, and she came with a small lacquered fan and a pair of pale grey gloves, and the easy, unhurried step of a woman who had been crossing this hall on call days since she was 12. She kissed the dowager's cheek. She kissed Honoria's air. She accepted tea. She sat on the chintz settee and crossed her ankles and said, "What a sweet little arrangement you have made of the curtains, Duchess. So countrified. So restful." "Thank you, Lady Caroline." Caroline's gloved fingers settled on the lacquered handle of her parasol. "You will not, I think, attempt to keep them when you give your first dinner. Town tastes are firmer." "Lady Caroline is wise to remind us," Honoria said. "I had not yet considered the firmness of town tastes. I shall consult Aunt Maud." Caroline glanced at the dowager. The dowager poured a cup of tea with the unhurried precision of a woman who had been pouring tea in this drawing room since before Caroline was born. And she handed the cup to Honoria, and she said, "I find the curtains very pleasant, Caroline. They were Maria's. I am glad to see them up again." Caroline's hand closed for a fraction of a second too long around the rim of her own saucer. She covered it. Of course. Maria had such sentimental tastes. She had, the Dowager said evenly, the taste of a woman who knew what she liked. I shall not be persuaded to take down what she put up. Carry on, Honoria. Caroline tried twice more. She tried Honoria's pronunciation of a French phrase. Honoria answered in faultless Parisian. She tried Honoria's connections. Wexford in the Marsh, was it not? I do not believe I know the county. And Honoria said, very pleasantly, It is in Suffolk, my lady, 3 miles inland of Aldborough. My uncle's tithe book has a very full list, if you are curious. There was a small silence after the tithe book. Caroline let it lie. She moved her ground. Tell me, Duchess, she said, what does one do at Carrington in the mornings? I had caught you keep an early hour. I read with His Grace. You read? The cup paused at the lip of the saucer for the space of a held breath. In the library, yes. What do you read? At present, Honoria said, we are reading the Almanach du Commerce of the year 1819. His Grace has an interest in the Mediterranean trade in fats and oils. I have been useful in the French. He is good enough to find me useful. She took a small, unhurried sip of her tea. She did not look at Caroline over the rim. She did not need to. I expect we shall move on, presently, to the bills of lading from the Liverpool Exchange. It is dry work. I am fond of dry work. The cup made the smallest of sounds in Caroline's hand. How diverting, Caroline said. I find it so. The June light fell through the south window onto Caroline's pale hand and made nothing of it. And does the Duke find it so also? You must ask him. He's in the estate room. Shall I send for him? On no account. Then perhaps another day. Perhaps. The Dowager, on Honoria's right, poured a second cup of tea, with the air of a woman watching an entertainment of which she had not, until this afternoon, expected to approve. She set the pot down. She said, Caroline, my dear, how is your cousin in Liverpool? Mr. Pelham. Hugh, was it? I had heard he is now the principal partner at Pelham & Sons. Such a forward house. Caroline's face did not move. The small bright spot of colour at the high crest of her cheekbone did. Hugh is in excellent health, Aunt Maud. I am glad. The Dowager's smile did not reach her eyes. He keeps a busy correspondence. Yes, I expect he must. The Mediterranean trade is so diverting, as you say. The Dowager smiled. The smile, Honoria thought with a small, private shock, was not kind. The Dowager had landed the blow without any apparent effort, and she had landed it on Honoria's behalf, and Caroline had felt the prick of it, and was now holding herself very still in the chintz settee to keep her face from showing it. Honoria filed it. She filed the wallpaper, the curtains, the almanac, Hugh Pelham of Liverpool, the Dowager's smile, and the small bright spot on Caroline's cheekbone. And she thought, very clearly, this is a war. I should perhaps have thought to ask. Caroline rose at the appointed quarter hour. She kissed the Dowager. She did not kiss Honoria's air a second time, but extended a gloved hand and said, I shall call again, Duchess. We are to be friends, are we not? For Carrington's sake. For Carrington's sake, Honoria said evenly, and she did not let go of the gloved hand at once, but held it for the small additional second that signaled, between women, a thing being noted and remembered. Caroline's eyes flickered. When the door closed behind her, the Dowager sat for a moment without speaking. Then she said, She came to look at you. She has seen you. She will, by Friday, be writing to Hugh in Liverpool. Yes, Aunt. You knew. I had guessed. The almanac was, perhaps, a small unkindness on my part. It was a small, extraordinary unkindness, child. I should have offered her the almanac myself if I had thought of it. The dowager rose. She crossed to the chintz settee where Caroline had sat, and she straightened, with two small, precise tugs, the cushion Caroline had displaced. I think I shall write to my own cousin in Liverpool this evening. He is in shipping. He has had opinions about Hugh Pelham for some years which I had not, until today, been inclined to credit. Will you come and sit with me while I write? Yes, Aunt. The dowager folded the sheet of her cousin's letter and laid it down on top of the morning's paragraph. Bring your work. If we are at war, we may as well work at war together. She brought her work. They sat at the writing table the dowager had moved the day before, and at some hour past 5, the Duke came in from the estate room with mud on his boots, and looked at the two of them sitting at the same desk, and said, Have I missed Caroline? You have, the dowager said. Honoria has, on your behalf, made very free with the Almanach du Commerce. Caroline has, in consequence, gone home a little earlier than she had perhaps intended. The Duke looked at Honoria, the corner of his mouth pulled. Madam? She inclined her head. Tomorrow, he said, I am taking you to see my brother's herbarium. It is in the East Wing. I think you will find use in it. At what hour, Your Grace? 6:30. The clock in the corridor struck the half hour as he spoke. I shall be ready. He went out. The dowager looked at the closed door for a moment, and then she looked at Honoria. He is taking you to Henry's herbarium. She said yes. He has not been into that room since May. Oh. He will go in tomorrow because he is taking you. He will not say that to you. You will not say it to him. But you will remember, child, that I told you so. The dowager folded her own letter. She sealed it with a small, neat, practiced pass of the wax stick. Now I have made you cry, and we have not the time for it. Wipe your eyes. The dressing bell will go in 20 minutes, and we are to have the bishop at dinner. She had not been crying. She wiped her eyes all the same. The East Wing herbarium was at the head of a long, flagged corridor that smelled of dust and beeswax, and very faintly of dried thyme. The Duke unlocked the door himself, pressed it open, and stepped aside. Madam, after you. She went in. The room had been Henry's. It had the unmistakable stillness of a room whose owner had been about to come back to it. 3 long deal tables ranged under the north windows, with the great folio specimen books in calf, the specimen frames with the screws still in them, a mortar and pestle, and a pair of brass dividers laid across an open botanical Latin glossary. A coat hung on a peg behind the door, a green frieze country coat, the elbows worn shiny, and the absence of its owner was so complete that Honoria felt, for the first time, the full strangeness of her position. She was being trusted with the footprint of a man long gone. She took off her gloves. The Duke had gone to the window. He stood with his back to her, his hands clasped behind him, looking out at the parterre below. He did not speak. She crossed to the nearest deal table, and she opened the first specimen book at random, and she read down the calf-bound page in Henry Hartley's neat amateur botanist's hand, and she said, after perhaps 2 minutes, Your Grace, this specimen is mislabeled. Is it? It is labelled Genista tinctoria, dyer's broom. It is Genista anglica, the petty whin. The leaves are too small, and the calyx wrong. Tinctoria has a calyx with 5 sharp lobes. This has none. Henry has made a perfectly natural error. Genista anglica is the rarer plant, and only one inland Suffolk parish in 12 sees a sample of it. He will not have known what he was looking at. There was a long silence. The Duke turned. She kept her eyes from him a moment longer. She was looking at the specimen, and at the tiny dried calyx, and at Henry Hartley's confident penciled marginalia. But is this not perhaps the southern form? The question mark, she thought, was the question mark of a man who had suspected he was wrong and had not had the time to confirm it. When she looked up, the Duke was watching her with an expression she could not read. He held her gaze for what felt to her, in the dust-stilled room, a very long while, and then he said, in a voice she had not previously heard from him, low and a little roughened. "Show me." She showed him. She brought the specimen to the window, laid the dried plant on the sill, set her finger on the calyx, and explained, voice even, Latin plain, the precise points of difference between Tinctoria and Anglica, and the reasons one might confuse them in early summer. The Duke listened without interrupting. He did not look at the specimen. He looked, the entire time, at her face. When she had finished, he said, "Henry would have liked you. He was a careful botanist. He was not a brilliant one. He would have liked very much to be corrected by a careful, brilliant one. He would have liked you very much." She did not know what to say. She looked down at the dried calyx. She said, "I am sorry, Your Grace, for your loss." "Yes." He turned back to the window. "Thank you." There was a silence. The dust moved in the bar of light across the deal table. Outside, somewhere in the parterre, a gardener was scything. The long rhythmic hiss of the blade came up to them at intervals like a long, slow breath. He said, without turning, "There is a small ledger in the second drawer of that desk. It is in Henry's hand. It records, by Linnaean name, the consignments of a certain Liverpool rough. I had thought, until this morning, that the names were Henry's own private system, an amateur botanist's whim, to label commercial cargoes with botanical Latin. I am beginning to suspect that the names are a key." She crossed to the desk. She opened the second drawer. The ledger was small, calf-bound, 8 inches by 6, and she lifted it out with both hands. "A substitution key," she said. "I believe so." She turned the small grey scrap toward the window and held it to the light. "To match the cipher passages in the French letters?" "I believe so." She turned the page. The first entry read, 3rd March consignment, Genista Anglica, 8 crates, Cadiz. She looked up. The Duke was watching her. He had not moved from the window. She said, very quietly, "Your Grace, Genista Anglica is the rarest plant in this collection. He is using it to flag the consignments he believed to be the secondary kind. He is telling us, by the Latin name, which cargoes were not what they were declared to be. He left us a marked key. He left it for whoever came next." The Duke did not speak for a moment. Then he crossed the room. He took the ledger from her hands. He set it down on the table. He stood very close to her. Closer than he had stood at the altar, closer than he had stood when he handed her into the carriage. And he did not touch her, and he said, very quietly, "Madam, I owe my brother an apology I cannot pay. I shall not be foolish enough to refuse the apology when it is paid through my wife's hand. Will you take the ledger to the library? We will work on it together." "Yes, Your Grace." She returned it. "Yes, Adrian." He went out. She had now 4 pieces of the puzzle. The cipher key, the lost brother, Hugh Pelham of Liverpool, and a husband who had said, in this room, 2 sentences she did not believe a duke had ever said to a wife, of 2 days before. She walked back to the library, with the ledger pressed against her ribs, and she set it down on the desk in the bay window, where the green-shaded lamp burned low against the brightening day. And she opened the ledger to the first entry, and she began, in her own neat, unhurried hand, to map Henry Hartley's botanical Latin against the 3rd March cipher passages he had not lived to decode himself. They worked together at the bay window desk for the next 11 days. The Dowager, by the 3rd day, had taken to carrying her own writing box up to the library after dinner, and pretending, very politely, not to listen to what passed between her great-nephew and his wife across the desk. He came to know to set the directory at her left elbow without being asked. She came to know that he took his coffee black at 6 and white with milk at 3, and that the small flat sigh he gave at 4 in the afternoon was the sound of his shoulder remembering an old riding fall. On the 7th evening, when she rose for the dressing bell and her own back stiffened from the long sitting, He stood and said, without ceremony, "Madam, roll your shoulder back. You have set it wrong." And she rolled her shoulder back, and the ache went out of it, and she thanked him. By the 9th day, she had decoded 27 of the 43 letters. By the 11th, she had identified the 3 Liverpool houses and the 4 Cadiz buyers, and the 2 London merchant banks through which the secondary consignments were financed. The name Pelham came forward, by direct attribution, in 9 of the 27, and by inference in another 6. She wrote it on a slip of paper, folded into the lining of her sleeve, meaning to give it to him on the morning of the 12th day. She never reached the estate room. The morning of the 12th day was a Friday. The newspaper came up to the library with the post at 10:30. Mrs. Galpin, the housekeeper, brought it in herself, which was the first sign that something had altered, because the post was always brought up by the second footman, and Mrs. Galpin had not, in 11 days, set her foot in the library above stairs. She came in. She closed the door. She laid the folded newspaper on the desk in front of Honoria. She said, very quietly, "Your Grace, there is a paragraph in the column. I thought it best you should see it before His Grace." Honoria unfolded the paper. The paragraph was in the 3rd column of the 2nd page, in the Morning Chronicle's social section, set in a small italic. "It is whispered in the better drawing-rooms of Mayfair that a certain young duke, lately married to a country gentlewoman of obscure connection from one of the eastern counties, has cause to regret his summer haste. The new duchess, it is said, has been observed in the small hours of the morning in the library of the great house, in undress, in shirt-sleeves, applying herself with surprising particularity to her husband's most private correspondence. Whether the duke, who has of late professed in the Lords so warm an interest in the suppression of certain trades, is aware that his bride takes so very keen an interest in the same trades, and on whose behalf, is a question now agitating the politer circles of the town. The Duke's late brother is said to have entertained certain eccentric botanical interests. The Duchess, it appears, has inherited them. Honoria read it twice. She set the paper down. She held her breath 1 beat. Then she breathed 4 counts, and she said to Mrs. Galpin, evenly, "Where is His Grace?" "He has ridden out, Duchess. He took the bay at 9. He left word he would not be back until dinner." "Where is Her Grace, the Dowager?" "In her own sitting-room, Duchess. She has the paper. She had it brought to her at 10. Mrs. Galpin curtsied and held the door. "Tell her I shall come to her in a quarter of an hour." "Yes, Duchess." Mrs. Galpin went out. Honoria sat at the desk with the paper folded under her palm. She felt the small, clean, cold rage rise up from her belly to her throat, and she sat with it for the count of 40. And then she set it aside. The paragraph would be in every drawing-room in London by tea-time. The phrase, "in undress," in shirt-sleeves, would be repeated as fact within 48 hours. The paragraph had not been written by a journalist. It had been written, at one remove, by a person who knew the inside of Carrington's library at 6 in the morning, who knew the cipher work concerned Liverpool houses and the trade. There was, in the world, exactly one such person who was hostile to Honoria. She went to the Dowager. The Dowager had the paper open on her writing table. She did not rise. She kept her silence a long moment. She had been weeping. Honoria saw the small mark of it at the corner of her left eye, brushed away with a careful thumb, but not, in the slightly broken angle of her mouth, quite hidden. Honoria sat down opposite her without being asked. "This is Caroline," the Dowager said. "It is one of 2 people, Aunt, both surnamed Pelham." "It is Caroline." Hugh would have given the commercial detail. Only Caroline could have given the chemise. "She has been in this house for a fortnight running, while we were at Brighton last summer. She would have came to know the library's hour from a maid." "It is Caroline." She said yes. "She has cost you, child." "She has cost His Grace more. The paragraph touches my reputation. It touches the bill in the Lords. The bill goes to committee in 3 months. If the committee chairman is now perceived as having married a woman who is the half-paid agent of the very interests he means to suppress. The dowager closed her eyes for the small, measured count of 3. I had not thought of that. It is what Caroline thought of, Aunt. The chemise was decoration. The bill is the target. The dowager looked at her for a long moment. You are not weeping, she said. I shall weep, perhaps, later. I shall not weep this morning. This morning we are to draft a reply. She rose and went to the writing table by the window. A reply? Not to the paper. To Caroline. The dowager set down her pen. Child, I do not propose to write to Caroline. I propose to call on her, this afternoon, with you, in the small landau, with the Carrington arms on the door, and in the dove-grey gown. We shall have it pressed. A perfectly ordinary call. We shall stay the precise minute that propriety demands. We shall depart. And the half of London who saw us go up the steps will understand that the Duchess of Carrington called on Lady Caroline Pelham on the morning the paragraph came forward, and that the Duchess did not flinch. The dowager held her silence a long moment. Then she said, That is rather magnificent. It is rather necessary. The dowager set her cup down on the saucer without sound. Carrington will object. Carrington is not here to object. You are a very dangerous young woman, Honoria. I am the woman His Grace married, Aunt. I had thought, perhaps, that he had foreseen it. They went at 3. The dove-grey had been pushed. The Carrington arms were on the door. The landau took them 7 miles southeast to Pelham Court, a modern house, faced in pale stone, fashionable, almost insolently new. Lady Caroline received them in the morning room. She had not expected them. Honoria saw it in the small, careful pause before Caroline rose from her writing desk, and in the very faint pinkness at the high crest of her cheekbone, which had not, on Wednesday's call, been pink at all. Caroline kissed the dowager. Caroline did not kiss Honoria. They sat. Tea was sent for. What an unexpected pleasure, Caroline said. We were passing, the dowager said pleasantly. Honoria wished to see the new lime walk. She is laying out a similar avenue at Carrington this autumn, and I told her you had the very best example in the county. Your father had it at Repton, did he not? He did. Caroline's smile fixed itself for a fraction longer than civility required. I shall consult him about Carrington's, Honoria said. Perhaps you could give me an introduction, Lady Caroline. Caroline paused. I should be happy to. They sat. The tea came. Caroline poured. She attempted, Honoria noticed, none of the sharp, soft barbs of Wednesday. The paragraph in the Chronicle had been Caroline's barb, and Caroline had not expected to find the woman the barb was aimed at sitting in her morning room 2 hours after the paper had came forward. Her hand was a little unsteady on the pot. She set it down. The conversation went on, vacuously, for the precise 9 minutes that propriety demanded between the pouring of tea and the rising. Honoria spoke when spoken to. She made no reference, by syllable, to the paragraph. She drank her tea. She rose. At the door, she turned. She held out her hand. Lady Caroline, he used the title. Thank you for the call. We shall hope to see you at Carrington again, very soon. Caroline took her hand. Honoria did not release the hand at once. She held it, with the precise additional pressure that signaled, between women, a thing being noted and remembered. And she looked into Caroline's eyes and she said, very pleasantly and very quietly so the dowager could not hear, I shall write to Mr. Repton tomorrow. I shall also be writing, by Tuesday, to your cousin Hugh in Liverpool. You may, if you choose, write to him first. Caroline's eyes did not move. The high crest of her cheekbone went a half-shade paler. Duchess, she said. She used the form. Honoria released the hand. She turned. She walked to the landau on the dowager's arm. The footman handed them up. The horses moved. The drive of Pelham Court fell behind them between the orderly limes. The dowager said, after the first quarter-mile, "What did you say to her at the door?" "I told her I should write to Repton." "Liar." The dowager's mouth twitched at the corner. It might have been a smile, or its cousin. "And to her cousin Hugh in Liverpool. By Tuesday." The dowager sat back against the squab. She looked, for a long moment, out at the hedges sliding past. Then she laughed. A small, dry, surprised laugh that Honoria had not previously heard from her, and which she would remember afterwards, with a small, private warmth. "Child, you have just declared war upon a woman who was raised in my own drawing room." "I have only answered hers, Aunt. She declared first." "You are right. She declared first." The dowager closed her eyes. "I am very glad, Honoria, that he chose for himself. I am also very glad that he chose you. I should not have said so a fortnight ago. I say so now. Forgive me, my Tuesday." The carriage took the turn at the lodge gates, and the lime avenue closed behind them like a slow green door. "Forgiven, Aunt." They rode the rest of the way back to Carrington in a comfortable silence. The Duke met them on the steps. He had come back at 5, an hour earlier than promised, and the paragraph had reached him in the estate room, and his face, when he saw the dowager and Honoria descending from the landau in their pushed gowns, was the face of a man who had spent 2 hours preparing a speech he was not, on inspection, going to have to give. He handed Honoria down himself. He did not speak. He took her gloved hand and held it for the small additional second that signaled between them a thing being noted, and he said, very quietly so the footman could not hear, "Madam, where in God's name have you been?" "Pelham Court. The dowager wished to admire the lime walk." "The lime walk?" "It is by Repton, 28 feet. "Madam." The Duke's hand at her elbow tightened for a fraction and then loosed again. "His Grace will allow," the dowager said, sweeping past them up the steps in her black bombazine, "that the lime walk at Pelham is admirable. We have been admiring it. We are now extremely tired and propose to take tea in my sitting room. Carrington, do not detain her. We are in the middle of a project." The Duke watched his great-aunt disappear into the hall. He looked back down at Honoria. His face was doing a thing she had not, in 12 days, seen it do. The small private rearrangement of a man who is not, on this occasion, going to manage to keep his expression in order. "You went to her," he said. She said yes. "With the paragraph in every drawing room of the town. Because of it." He looked at her for a long moment, the corner of his mouth pulled, the other corner pulled. He withheld the full smile. He was a man who had not yet earned, in his own private accounting, the right to smile fully at her on the steps of his own house, in front of 2 footmen and a groom. But he kept her hand. He kept it the small additional second a third time, and he said very quietly, "Madam, you are not what I asked your uncle for." "What did you ask my uncle for, Adrian?" "A clever woman who would not flinch." "I have not flinched, Your Grace." His thumb passed once across the back of her glove and did not return. No. His thumb passed once across the back of her gloved hand. "You have not. God forgive me, you have not. Come in. We have, I believe, a great deal of letter-writing to do this evening." She went in. Caroline did not write to Hugh in Liverpool. Hugh in Liverpool wrote to Caroline, on the Tuesday morning, in the small, grim hand of a man who has had a letter from a Suffolk-bred duchess, and has not, in his 8 years as principal partner of Pelham & Sons, had quite that sort of letter before. The dowager, in her sitting room that evening, paused over her cousin in Liverpool's reply, for the cousin in Liverpool, prompted by the dowager's letter of the previous week, had begun to make discreet inquiries at the Liverpool Exchange, and she said, "Honoria, my cousin writes that Hugh's house has, within the past 48 hours, withdrawn 3 consignments from the Cadiz manifest." 3. She looked up. Child, you have frightened him. I have not yet frightened him, Aunt. I have warned him. There is a difference. The fright will come in November. In November? The committee sits in November. The bill will go up with the decoded letters as an appendix. 43 letters by then, with Henry's marked key. We shall, between us, have made Hugh Pelham of Liverpool the most studied private name in the prize courts before Christmas. The fire shifted in the grate and sent up a small column of pale ash. And Caroline? Honoria held her answer a moment. She thought of the high crest of Caroline's cheekbone going pale. She thought of the morning room at Pelham Court, with its tessellated marble hall and its fashionable air. She thought of the woman who had been raised in the Dowager's drawing room, who had spent every summer of her childhood at Carrington, who had been waiting, since Easter, for an offer that had not come. Caroline, she said, will do, I think, one more thing. What? I do not yet know, but she is not finished. She would not have written that paragraph if she had been finished. She wrote it because she had something larger to come, and she wanted the ground softened first. The Dowager set her pen down. You are very young to be so old, child. I had a careful uncle, Aunt. You had a very careful uncle. The Dowager looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, Go to bed. You have a fortnight of work in front of you, and a husband who has begun, I think, to mean rather more by the word duchess than he had at the outset, and a great aunt who proposes, if you will permit her, to be of some use to you. We shall, between us, manage Caroline. The Dowager folded the reply once and once again, and put it beneath the candlestick. Yes, Aunt. Good night, child. Good night. Caroline's one more thing came on a Thursday in late August. It came in the form of a printed pamphlet, 8 pages, octavo, on cheap paper, anonymous, run off a press in Holborn that had, in past years, done other useful work for the more nervous corners of the Liverpool interest. The pamphlet did not name the Duke or the Duchess. It did not have to. It described, in lurid, sober paragraphs, and with the careful pretense of a public-spirited correspondent, the dangers of a recent fashion in the high households of England for the employment of foreign-trained women as private translators of commercial correspondence. French women, it suggested, or English gentlewomen of obscure parentage who had been improperly educated abroad. Such women, the pamphlet pressed, were in the pay of foreign houses. The secrets of British shipping and British credit were daily passed through their hands to interests in Paris, Cadiz, and Liverpool. The Aberdeen Committee in particular was now suspected of being so far compromised by such a connection in its own chair's household that the bill in preparation could not be regarded as the work of an English mind. It did not name. It did not have to. There were 200 copies in circulation in St. James's by tea-time, and 300 more by noon the following day, and the Duke received the first of them at the estate-room door by 10 o'clock that morning, from the hand of his own Member of Parliament, who had thought it best to bring it down from town in person. He kept indoors this time. He brought the pamphlet up to the library. He laid it on the bay window desk in front of his wife. He said, Madam, read this and tell me what you think. She read it. She held her silence a long moment. She read it twice. She put it down. She said, This was not Caroline. No. The cadence is wrong. Caroline writes in the chemise register. Small, private, deniable, gossip-shaped. This is a tract. It is meant to land in the columns of the better papers and to be reprinted by the worst. This is Hugh. She said yes. It mentions the committee chair by implication. It does. It will be debated, in some form, in the Lords by the end of the week. It will. He folded the printed sheet against the table edge, as if it were a piece of correspondence to be filed. You will be obliged to answer it. I will. And me? You, he said evenly, will not be obliged to answer anything. I shall answer for both of us. The pamphlet has put the question publicly. I shall give it the public answer. I shall stand up in the Lords on Friday and say that the translations of the French commercial correspondence before the Aberdeen Committee have been prepared by my wife, who reduced the substitution cipher of the Liverpool secondary trade in 4 days, and whose work will be appended to the bill at second reading. I shall name you. I shall name your uncle. I shall name Henry. The pamphlet will be ash by Saturday. She held her silence a long moment. She looked down at the pamphlet. She looked back up at him. They will say, she said, that you have invented a learned wife to cover a scandal. Some will say it. She looked at his face. He was working out, she saw, the order of the speeches. It will hurt the bill. It may hurt it for a week. It will pass. She returned it. Madam, this is the work of years. You cannot, on a Friday morning, stake the chairmanship of the Aberdeen Committee on a fortnight's testimony from a wife London does not yet trust. I do not stake the chairmanship on testimony from my wife. I stake it on the work. The work is good. The work is yours. The chairmanship was given to me by the Lords. If the Lords wish, in light of the work, to remove it from me, they may. I shall, in either case, be permitted to retain my opinions and my vote. I do not require the chair to be of use to the bill. I require the bill to pass. The naming of you is the cheapest price the bill will pay this year. She rose. She crossed to the bay window. She put her palm flat against the warm glass. She breathed 4 counts. She turned. Then we shall write your speech tonight, Adrian. Together. Together. And the appendix to the bill. We shall have a fair copy ready for the committee by Monday. She said yes. She came back to the desk. She picked up the pamphlet. She tore it across once, neatly, and again, and she dropped the 4 pieces into the fire that Mrs. Galpin, in the wisdom of 14 years' service, had laid in the library grate that morning, against the chill of an August storm coming in off the channel. The pieces caught. The flame brightened. She watched them char. Adrian? She said yes. Caroline did not write the pamphlet, but she gave Hugh the chemise. Hugh built the pamphlet on the chemise. She knew what she was doing when she put the chemise in the Chronicle. She is not. She paused. She is not blameless in this. No, she is not blameless. What shall we do about her? He looked at her for a long moment. He set his hands on the back of the desk chair. Nothing, he said. We shall do nothing about her. Caroline will, I believe, do the thing herself. The Lord's speech went on the Friday following, and the Aberdeen Committee began to sit in November as appointed, and the bill passed, in modified but recognizable form, on the 11th of March of the following year. Between the Friday and the March, however, Honoria lived 2 scenes which she would return to afterwards in her own mind, with the same careful, unhurried attention she had given to the cipher transcripts at 6 in the morning of the first day of her marriage. The first was a Wednesday afternoon in late September at a charity concert in the Hanover Square Rooms. At the second interval, Honoria slipped out of the box for a glass of water. She went down the back stair and came out, by a curtained doorway, in the small antechamber where the patrons' wives left their wraps. The antechamber was supposed to be empty. A single low lamp burned on the side table. Honoria stopped at the doorway because she had heard, in the quiet, the small, involuntary sound of a person breathing the breath that comes only when they believe themselves entirely alone. Lady Caroline Pelham stood at the side table with her back to the doorway. She had, in her left hand, a small oval miniature on a worn green ribbon. She was looking down at it. The miniature was very small, 2 inches, no more, and showed, Honoria saw at the half-turn of Caroline's wrist, the face of a young man in naval uniform, with the high blue collar of an officer of the Trafalgar generation. Caroline's thumb passed across the painted face. Then she pressed the miniature, very briefly, to her own mouth. Not a kiss, not quite. the small, private pressure of a person carrying a wound too long to acknowledge in the daylight. And she closed her fingers over the ribbon, and her shoulders moved once, in a single, long, held-down breath. And they were still again. Honoria did not move. She stepped back into the shadow of the passage and counted to 20 before she moved. By the time she returned to her box by the long way, the third movement had begun, and the Duke looked at her once and saw that something had altered in her face, and asked nothing of her in the music. She did not tell him for 3 days. On the morning of the 4th day, walking with him in the parterre, she said, "Adrian, Caroline had a brother who was lost at sea." She had, in 1810, Captain Charles Pelham, the Resolute off Cape Trafalgar. She was 11. There was a great deal said at the time about the conduct of the Liverpool houses in the affair of the Resolute, but it was not provable, and the family closed ranks. Hugh has been the head of the family since the father was lost in 1815. Caroline has, I believe, lived in fear of him ever since. She was holding a miniature of Charles in her hand at the concert. In the wrap room, she thought herself alone. The Duke walked on a few paces. I had not known she still carried it. She used to wear it openly when we were children. Henry made a copy of it once, in his own clumsy hand, that summer Charles came down on leave. They were thick as thieves, Henry and Caroline. He used to say, when we were grown, that he had wanted to marry her himself, but that her family had set their hearts on a duke, and that he, being only a duke's brother, could not ask. Did Henry know what Hugh's house was doing in the Mediterranean? He had begun to suspect. He left the marked ledger. The Duke stopped walking. He turned to her. The parterre was very still in the September sun. I had supposed Caroline was what she appeared to be at the breakfast on our wedding day, a woman who had hoped for an offer and had been refused it. I had supposed her capable of small spite and not more. The pamphlet I had laid at Hugh's door, if you are now telling me Caroline still carries Charles in her writing box. I am telling you, Honoria said, that the chemise was Caroline's, because nobody else could have known it, and that the chemise was a small, spiteful thing she did at her cousin Hugh's prompting, and that the pamphlet has, in its own grim way, hurt her as much as it has hurt us. She is afraid of him, Adrian. She has been afraid of him since she was 11. I do not propose to forgive her the chemise. I propose to remember that she is, on the matter of Hugh, very nearly on our side, and does not know it. The Duke looked at her for a long, quiet moment. "Madam," he said, "I had thought, on the morning of our wedding, that I had married a clever woman who would not flinch. I had not foreseen, I had not, perhaps, allowed myself to foresee, that I had married a kind one as well. I am not kind, Adrian. I am only fair. It is the same thing, or it ought to be." He took her hand and did no more in the open parterre. He held her hand for the small additional second that signalled, between them, a thing being noted. And he said, "I shall write to Caroline this afternoon. I shall ask her to call. Alone, in the library, at an hour of her choosing. We shall, between us, manage Hugh." The lime leaves above them caught a small movement of wind and let it go. Together. Together. Caroline came on a Tuesday in the second week of October. She came in a plain travelling dress and without the lacquered fan, and she sat in the chair by the bay window where Honoria had sat at 6 in the morning on her first day in this house, and she kept her eyes lowered for the first quarter hour to either of theirs. She drank no tea. She set her gloves on her lap. She said in a voice Honoria did not recognize, "I have brought you something. I had meant to bring it in March. I lost the courage. I do not propose to lose it again." She lifted, from her reticule, a small, folded square of paper sealed with a green wafer. She held it out across the desk. "Duchess, this is the plate from which the August pamphlet was printed. I bought it back from the printer in Holborn last week. He had been holding it on Hugh's account for a second impression. He will not be holding it any longer. The plate is broken. The wafer is my own. The note is in my hand. Read it. Honoria broke the wafer. She unfolded the note. She read it in the silence of the library, with her husband standing very still by the chimneypiece. The note ran, in Caroline Pelham's small, careful schoolroom hand. I withdraw, without reservation, every word that I caused to be printed against the Duchess of Carrington in the public columns and in the anonymous tract of August last. The chemise paragraph was my own. The tract was my cousin's, with my knowledge, and my cowardice in not preventing it is mine. I have, on my brother Charles's memory, no business being on Hugh's side. I have, until this autumn, been on Hugh's side because I have been afraid of him. I am still afraid. I am no longer his accomplice. Use this as you will. Caroline Pelham. Honoria read it twice. She folded it. She looked up at Caroline. Caroline was looking, very steadily, at the curtains, the lighter sprigged ones from the chintz parlour, which Honoria had hung on her second day in the house, and which Caroline had described, on the Wednesday call, as countrified and restful. Lady Caroline, Honoria said. He used the title. What does Hugh know of this visit? Nothing. I left Pelham at first light. I told my maid I was at a milliner's. He will not know until Friday. What do you want of us? Caroline's hand pressed flat against the surface of the lacquered tea table. Protection. Not for myself. For my mother. She is at Bath. She is 64. Hugh has, in the past, made trouble for her when I have crossed him. I do not ask you to spare him. I ask you only to spare her. You have it, the Duke said, very quietly. He had kept his silence until then. He crossed the room. He sat down on the corner of the desk near Caroline's elbow. He said, Caroline, I should have come to you in March. I should have asked you, before the wedding, where Charles's miniature was. I failed of it, and I should have done it. Forgive me. Caroline's eyes filled. She did not let the tears fall. She set her gloves more carefully on her lap. She said, Adrian, you owe me nothing. I have done you a great deal of harm. You have done me less harm than Hugh has done you. We are not, this afternoon, in the business of accounts. We are in the business of the bill. The bill? It goes to its second reading on the 11th of March. Honoria's appendix will be appended. Hugh's house will be named. He will, if he is wise, withdraw quietly. If he is not wise, he will be exposed. I would prefer the former, for your mother's sake. I shall write to him this evening, in my own hand, and offer him the choice. Will you carry the letter? Honoria moved to the side table and poured Caroline a glass of water. Caroline drank a sip and set it down. I will. And will you come back to us when it is done? Caroline lifted her eyes. They were wet, but very plain. If you will have me, Adrian. We shall have you. Honoria! We shall have her, Honoria said. Caroline rose. She offered no gloved hand this time for a duchess to hold or release. She stepped around the desk, and she took Honoria's hand in both of hers, and she held it for a small, precise moment, and she said, Duchess, the chemise, It is past, Caroline. Caroline's gloved hand paused at the door handle. It is not past. But you have been generous, and I shall not insult the generosity by making more speeches. Good afternoon. She left. The Duke stood at the bay window and watched her carriage move down the drive. He did not turn. He said, after a long moment, Madam, we have, I believe, won the bill this afternoon. We have, I believe, also won a friend. I had not foreseen either. You had not foreseen, perhaps, the second? She said no. It is the better of the two, Adrian. She said yes. He turned. The afternoon light was on his face. He looked at her for a long, quiet moment. He said, Will you come with me to Carrington for the rest of the autumn? Town will keep till January. I find I should like to be at home with my wife. Yes, Adrian. He set down the pen. The library was very still. In the morning. In the morning. They went in the morning. They were at Carrington by sundown. The autumn that year was the most precious 6 weeks of Honoria's life. The Duke teaching her to ride properly on a quiet bay mare he had bought for her in September without telling her. The Duke walking with her along the east terrace at dusk, his shoulder through hers without ceremony, talking, at last, about his brother. The Duke laughing in the library at a small, unguarded remark she made about the bishop's sermon. The Duke at breakfast on the third Sunday of October passing her, without comment, a folded note, in which his own hand had written, "When the lilacs come out next spring, we shall be at home." And she had folded it into the lining of her stays, and she kept it, ever after, in the same place. She had not, at 26, expected easy happiness. She held it carefully. She thought, every morning of those 6 weeks, this is borrowed. It was taken from her on a Tuesday in mid-November, by her own hand, or so, in the cold black centre of that Tuesday, she believed. She came down into the library at 5:30 and found the desk empty, and the green-shaded lamp unlit, and the bay window black against a winter dawn that had not yet come. The Duke had gone, the night before, into town for a meeting of the committee. He was not expected back until the Thursday. Mrs. Galpin had laid the post on the desk in 2 neat piles, his and hers, and Honoria, picking up the small pile of letters intended for the Duke to set them aside in the second drawer, saw on the top a letter directed in her husband's own hand to his solicitor in Lincoln's Inn. It had been written the previous evening and put into the post-bag before the Duke left, and had been returned to the house with the other letters because the post-bag had been the wrong bag, and the messenger had brought it back to be corrected. She did not open it. She set it aside. She picked up her own pile. She read her own correspondence, a long letter from her uncle, a short one from the Dowager's cousin in Liverpool, a printer's invoice from Holborn for the broken plate, and she set them aside, and her eye fell again on the letter to the solicitor, and she saw on the outside, in her husband's own square hand, the words for Mr. Greaves, settlement amendment, confidential, by hand only. She picked it up. She turned it over. The seal was a wax seal, but it had been pressed in haste in the dark before the Duke left. The impression of the Carrington seal was uneven, and the wax had broken cleanly across the seal, where the postbag had pressed against another letter. The letter had, in effect, opened itself. She should not have read it. She read it. She read it once. She read it twice. She read it a third time. She set it down on the desk in front of her. She put her hands flat on the table either side of the letter, and she sat for a long, quiet moment without breathing, while the winter dawn at the bay window slowly greyed. The letter ran, in part, "I shall require an amendment to the settlement of June last. The amendment shall provide for the continuation of the Duchess of Carrington's quarterly allowance during the term of her usefulness to the cause now agitating the Aberdeen Committee, and for an appropriate adjustment at the term of that usefulness, in such manner as Mr. Greaves shall advise." The settlement of June was, you will recall, drawn rapidly and against the press of the marriage. The principal value of the match to me has, throughout, been her usefulness to that cause, and I should not wish, when the cause is done, to find myself encumbered by an instrument I have outgrown. Pray attend on me at Carrington in the first week of December to draw the necessary papers. Honoria did not move. She sat at the bay window desk with her husband's letter open in front of her, and the winter dawn slowly greying behind her. And she read the words, "Term of her usefulness," and the words, "An instrument I have outgrown." And she felt the small, careful structure she had built across 214 mornings come down inside her chest, with the soft, unspectacular collapse of a thing that had not, in the end, been built on stone. He had married her for the work. He had told her so on the second morning, plainly and without ornament. And she had built, in the month since, a soft secondary architecture on top of the brief. The bay mare, the dusk on the east terrace, the laugh in the library, the note about the lilacs. And she had supposed, at some point during the autumn, that the secondary architecture had become the building. She had been wrong. The building was the brief. The bill would pass in March. The usefulness would be done. The instrument he had outgrown would be his wife. He had meant every syllable of the brief, and he had let her, in her fool's softness, build the rest. And now the brief was on the desk in his own square hand, and she had read it. She folded the letter. She set the broken seal as best she could. She wrote on a fresh sheet in her own neat, unhurried hand a short note to Mrs. Galpin. The post bag of last night was incorrectly returned. The enclosed letter for Mr. Greaves of Lincoln's Inn is to go out by this morning's bag at the usual hour. H. Carrington. She set the note and the letter in the housekeeper's box. She went back to the library. She put on her writing shawl. She lit the green-shaded lamp. She drew toward her the 40th of the 43 letters and worked through the 41st and the 42nd, and by 10 in the morning, the 43rd. She put them in a neat ordered pile on the table by the chimney-piece, with a covering note in her hand directing His Grace to the relevant cross-references for the committee. The work was done. She had been holding the last 3 transcripts back because she had liked the morning hours at the desk with him and had not wanted them to end. They had ended. She went up to her dressing room. She rang for her maid. She had her 2 day gowns and her dove grey and her travelling cloak packed into the small trunk she had brought from Suffolk in June, and she added to it the small folded note about the lilacs. She could not, in the end, leave it. She would carry it as a thing one carries from a place one is leaving. And she went down to the Dowager's sitting room. The Dowager was at her writing table. She looked up. She looked, very carefully, at Honoria's face. She set down her pen. Child. Aunt. You have had bad news. I have, this morning, read a letter I should not have read. The fault is mine. I am going to my uncle for the present. I shall write to His Grace from Suffolk. The work for the committee is complete. The transcripts are on the table in the library, with a covering note. There is nothing further I am required to do here. Child. Mrs. Wexford set her cup of tea aside without tasting it. Aunt, please. I am not equal this morning to a long conversation. The coach to London leaves the village at 2:30. I shall take it. I shall be at my uncle's by Friday. I shall write to you. I shall not. Her voice nearly went then. She steadied it. She did not let it go. I shall not write to His Grace at once. He will read what I leave him in the library. He will understand. Tell him... She stopped. Tell him nothing. He will know what I'd read. He will do as he thinks best. Do not, please, try to fetch me back. Will you give me your word? The Dowager looked at her for a long, long moment. I will not give you my word, child, she said. I shall give you, however, a fortnight. If, after a fortnight, you have not written to him, I shall come to Suffolk myself. Is that understood? It is understood, Aunt. Go then. Carrington's carriage will take you to the village. The coach is no carriage for a duchess. I shall not allow it. The carriage will be at the door in 20 minutes. The Dowager rose. She crossed the room. She took Honoria's face between her old, dry hands, and she said, very quietly, Child, he meant nothing, I think, of what you have read. I do not know what you have read. I know him. He did not mean it. There is more than one letter, ever, between people who have come to mean to one another what you and he have come to mean. You have read one letter. There will be others. Aunt, I have read the one that was true. You have read the one that was written before the others became true. That is not the same thing. The old woman's hands tightened a fraction on Honoria's face, and then loosed. It is, I think, today, the same thing. Then go. Go, child, and come back when you are able. She went, The carriage took her to the village. She slept that night at an inn at Chelmsford. She sat on the narrow bed and watched the moon rise white over slate roofs she did not know. And she made herself say the things she had been refusing to say since she had read the letter. He had married her for the brief. He had kept her for the brief. The brief was done. He had outgrown the instrument. She had wept twice on the road between Carrington and Chelmsford, and she had decided, outside Ingatestone, that she would not weep again. She kept the decision. She was on the road to Suffolk by 6. She reached her uncle's parsonage on the Thursday evening at the falling of the dusk. Her uncle was at the gate. He had had a note from the dowager, sent express despite Honoria's prohibition, and he had been waiting since noon. He did not embrace her. He took her trunk. He said, "Come in, child. There is bread, there is tea. I have lit the bookroom fire. You will tell me when you are ready." She told him on the Saturday morning. She gave him the letter. He read it. He held his silence, a long, quiet moment. Then he said, "Honoria, this letter is not a letter from a man who has outgrown his wife. It says, I have read what it says. I am a man of 40 years of reading commercial correspondence, child, and I am telling you that the man who wrote this is keeping a particular promise to himself, and finds, in the writing, that the promise has become difficult to keep. He is reminding himself of the brief because he has begun to forget it. He is asking his solicitor for an amendment that will allow him to keep, after the brief, what he has begun, in spite of himself, to want." Uncle. The fire in the small parlour cracked, once, and was still. "Read the last sentence again, child. Pray attend on me at Carrington in the first week of December to draw the necessary papers." What papers? In whose favour? Mr. Greaves is the cleverest settlement drafter in England, and the Duke is paying him to come down on a winter coach to amend an instrument already drawn. A man does not pay Greaves's fee to write his wife out. He pays it to write her in. He is trying, in his own honourable way, to tell his solicitor before he tells you. She did not speak for a long while. She read it again, with her uncle's reading laid over her own, and she saw the careful, evasive shape of the sentence, about an adjustment in such manner as Mr. Greaves shall advise, and the precise place where the Duke had stopped writing for the count of perhaps a minute, the small, almost imperceptible thickening of the ink, before he went on. She put her hands flat on either side of it. She breathed 4 counts. "Uncle, what ought I to do?" "Go back, child. By Monday's coach. Apologize for the running. He will, I expect, apologize for the letter. The 2 apologies belong on the same morning. The morning would best be soon." "Yes, uncle." She went, in the event, on Sunday. She went on Sunday, by the night coach, having sat through her uncle's evening service with the parishioners of St. Margaret's, and having taken his blessing in the porch, and having walked back to the parsonage, and packed the trunk in 20 minutes. She was at Carrington by the Tuesday morning at 5:30, in time to come down into the library at the usual hour. The green-shaded lamp was already lit. The bay window stood black against a winter dawn that had not yet come. Her husband sat in his shirt-sleeves at the desk with a letter open under his hand. Her own letter, the short, cold, neat one she had left for him on the morning she went. She had thought she had left it on the table by the chimney-piece. It had been, evidently, on the desk since Thursday. There was an inkstand, there was an empty pen, and there was a face such as she had not seen on a man since the morning she had told her uncle, at the age of 14, that her aunt had passed in the night. He looked up. He did not start. He had heard her on the back stair, and he had elected, as he had elected on the second morning of her marriage, not to give the sound the dignity of a turn of the head until he was ready for it. "Madam," he said. She returned it. "You have come back." "I have come back." "Why?" "Because my uncle told me to read your letter twice." The library was very still. The clock on the mantel was, for once, quiet. "Ah." He set down the pen he was not holding. He stood. He kept his distance in the long, quiet room a moment longer. He said, "I had written the letter to Greaves intending, God help me, I had written it intending to ask him to amend the settlement so that the quarterly allowance should continue if you ever left, by whatever route, the work or the marriage." He turned the pen on the blotter and went on. "I had begun to be afraid, in October, that you would, in the end, decide the work was the thing, and that I would, when it was done, have no claim to keep you. I had thought to set the claim aside in writing before I tried, in person, to make it differently." He met her eyes. "The letter was written by a coward, madam, and I had not realized until I wrote it that I had been a coward all along. I would have liked to have written it better. The fault was mine. I failed in the writing, of justice either to you or to what I had begun to feel. I am sorry. I'm very sorry." "Adrian." "Madam, please, let me finish. I rode to Lincoln's Inn on Thursday morning when the Dowager's Express reached me." He reached into the coat. "I have, today, in my coat pocket, a draft settlement amendment in Greaves's hand, which provides for the immediate and unconditional transfer of the Carrington jointure to your sole control, the cancellation of all clauses of usefulness, and the restoration of your dowry into your own name, and a manuscript copy of the speech I shall give in the Lords on Friday week." He laid both on the desk between them. "The speech announces my withdrawal from the chairmanship of the Aberdeen Committee. I cannot, by law, propose you for the chair. I can, however, withdraw and name you publicly as the prepared draftsman of the bill. The chair will go to Bruffham. You will go on record as the woman who made the bill possible. I shall, if you will permit it, be at home with you. The amendment, the speech, and the apology are what I have for you. I should be obliged if you would take them." He held out the papers. She held her hand back a moment. She crossed the carpet to the desk. She stood very close to him. She did no more in the long, quiet room. She looked at his face. The face was very tired. The face was the face of a man who had not slept since Thursday evening, and the small crease between his eyes was deeper than she had ever seen it, and there was, at the corner of his mouth, the faint tremor of a muscle that had been held under conscious control for several hours and was beginning to fail. She took the papers. She set them very carefully on the desk. She broke the seal of the amendment. She unfolded it. She read the opening clause aloud in her own neat, unhurried voice. "Mr. Greaves, to certify on behalf of His Grace the Duke of Carrington, that the Duchess of Carrington, Honoria, born Wexford, is and shall remain in perpetuity the sole legal beneficiary of the jointure of Carrington Park, without condition of usefulness, performance, or continued residence." She set the page down. She looked up. "Adrian?" He inclined his head. "The chairmanship is too high a price." "The chairmanship is what I owe you for the letter." "The letter was honest. It was the wrong honest. It was not, in the end, dishonest." She moved to the window. The light, by then, had begun to gather toward the lake. It was, however, ungenerous. I had not, in writing it, allowed for the woman who had answered Caroline at the door of her own morning room with the words, "I shall be writing to your cousin Hugh in Liverpool by Tuesday." The amendment is one apology. The speech is the other. Take them, madam. They are owed. If I keep them, they will sit on me wrongly for the rest of my life. She took them. She folded the amendment carefully. She folded the speech. She set both on the desk under the green-shaded lamp. She turned. She lifted her hand. She set her palm flat against his cheek. He closed his eyes. He covered her hand with his own. They stood for a long, quiet moment in the bay window, with the winter dawn greying behind them. She let go of the words she had rehearsed on the coach from Suffolk, because the words proved unnecessary. And he let go of the words he had rehearsed since Thursday, because they had been, all along, less than what was now in his hand. She bent her forehead to his. He let her. The lamp burned. The clock in the hall, somewhere very far away, struck 6. "Adrian," she said yes. "I shall keep the amendment. I shall not let you give up the chairmanship. We shall, between us, write the speech differently. There is a version of the speech that names me as draftsman and keeps you in the chair. We shall write it together. We shall give it on Friday week. We shall, between us, manage the Lords. Madam, Adrian, I did not marry you to take your office. I married you to do the work. The office is yours. The work is mine. The marriage is ours. There is room in a single morning for all three." He opened his eyes. He looked at her for a long, quiet moment. The corner of his mouth pooled. The other corner pooled. He smiled, this time fully. He had earned the right. "Madam, I shall, by your leave, kiss you. By my leave." He kissed her. It was quiet and unhurried and absolutely certain. His hand at the small of her back, her hand at the back of his neck, the green-shaded lamp burning low between them on the desk where they had worked the 214 mornings on the brief that had brought them together, and was no longer the only thing that held them. And she felt, against her mouth, the small, unhurried smile of a man who had, after 17 months of carrying a thing he could not put down, set it down at last. She did not weep. She had not wept for him in Chelmsford, and she did not weep for him now. She had decided outside Ingatestone that her weeping for this man was done, and that the rest, between them, was to be the slow, earned daylight work of two people who had learned to trust the same room. He drew back. He kept his hand at the small of her back. He said, "Madam, will you breakfast with me at 9? "I will breakfast with you at 9, Adrian." "Aunt Maud will be at breakfast." She knew. She will be, I think, a little smug. She is entitled to be smug. Let her. He smiled. The smile, this morning, reached all the way to his eyes. "And the bishop, on Sunday, will preach upon constancy. Let him." He inclined his head. "Yes. I should like, this morning, to walk in the parterre with you before the dressing bell. The frost will be on the box. There is, I think, a robin, who has been keeping me company in the estate room for a fortnight. I should like to introduce you." "Yes, Adrian." They walked in the parterre. The frost was on the box. The robin came down onto the gravel path and bobbed and was gone. They walked the long south wall arm in arm. They did not speak much. The dressing bell went at 8. They were at breakfast at 9. The dowager was, indeed, a little smug, and they let her be. And Miss Galpin, pouring the coffee, exchanged with the housekeeper at her elbow a small private look, of the sort that passes, in long-served households, between women who have lived through a great many weddings and a great many quiet returnings, and have learned, after 30 years' attention, to know one of those from another at the breakfast table without a single word having been said. The bill passed on the 11th of March. The Duke kept the chairmanship. The appendix was bound into the second reading papers with the heading, "Prepared by the Duchess of Carrington, from the French, on the evidence of the Liverpool Exchange." The words bold and unornamented on the title page. Hugh Pelham, of Liverpool, sailed for Buenos Aires on the 8th of April, with no fanfare. Lady Caroline came to Carrington for Easter, and stayed 3 weeks, and on the last Sunday before she left, she sat in the chintz settee in the south drawing-room, and said, very quietly, "Charles would have liked you, Duchess." And Honoria said, "Adrian's brother would have liked us all, Caroline." And the two women sat together in the lighter sprigged curtains without speaking further. In the second week of May, the lilacs came out at Carrington. Late that year, the spring having been cold, and the air of the parterre by mid-afternoon was thick with the particular heavy, sweet scent that Honoria would always afterwards associate with the words her husband had folded into a note for her the previous October. She came down to the parterre after breakfast in a new gown. Pale green, not the sage. The fashion of London had altered, and she had altered with it. And she walked along the south wall. The Duke was at the far end. He had a pair of secateurs in one hand and a small, heavy bough of lilac in the other. He turned as she came. The corner of his mouth pulled. "Madam." She inclined her head. "Adrian, please. We are alone." She returned it. He held out the bough. She took it. She set it across her shoulder. A footman came along the south wall with a tray. A second footman followed with 2 cane chairs. They set the chairs by the south wall and went away, and the dowager appeared at the upper terrace with her writing box, and waved once, and went back into the house, and Adrian and Honoria sat down in the cane chairs in the sun, with the lilacs heavy and white above them, and the bough of lilac across her shoulder. A great deal had happened in a year between them. A great deal more would happen before either of them was done. There would be evenings on the East Terrace, and mornings in the Lime Walk, and a great many quiet, small confidences exchanged in the bay window of the south drawing-room, with the lighter sprigged curtains catching the last of the sun. There would be a dowager who lived, in extreme good health, to her 92nd year. There would be a Lady Caroline Pelham, who, in 1827, married a quiet country member of Parliament from Cumberland, and who corresponded with the Duchess of Carrington, in her small, careful schoolroom hand, every fortnight for the rest of her life. But not yet. Not today. Today, the lilacs were out, and they sat in the cane chairs in the sun, and the bough was heavy on her shoulder, and her husband, the man London had told her on the morning of her wedding, was not what she should have been, closed his fingers, very lightly, around her free hand, and turned the ring twice on her finger, and said nothing at all. A year and 4 months later, at a charity concert in the Hanover Square Rooms, a dowager who had not been at the wedding turned to her neighbour during the first interval and said, with the bright certainty of a woman about to be put right, "Is this what they call a duchess these days? A parson's niece from Suffolk?" Her neighbour, who had been at the wedding, set her fan deliberately into her lap and answered her in a soft, even voice that carried, by accident or design, 3 rows in either direction. "Madam, that is the Duchess of Carrington. She is the woman who wrote the Aberdeen Bill out of French commercial cipher. She is the woman who survived the August pamphlet. She is the woman the Duke chose at 26, and would, by all accounts, choose again at 60. I should advise you, ma'am, to lower your voice. There is rather a strong feeling in this room on the subject. We do not, any longer, mock that bride." The first woman closed her fan. She closed her mouth. At the far end of the row, the Duke and Duchess of Carrington sat side by side. He turned his head a 1/4 inch toward her. She turned hers a 1/4 inch toward him. The corner of his mouth pulled, and the corner of hers pulled, and in the music they exchanged nothing at all. She set her hand on the arm of his chair. He set his over hers.